Have you ever noticed that some people don't argue when they're hurt? They don't slam doors, raise their voices, or demand an explanation. Instead, they become quieter. Their messages get shorter. Their laughter fades. They begin saying, "I'm fine," even when nothing feels fine at all. From the outside, it can seem confusing. If something matters so much, why say less instead of more? Yet beneath that silence is often a complicated psychological story, one that isn't about indifference, but about protection. And once you understand why some people grow quiet when they're hurt, you may never interpret silence the same way again. Most of us are taught to think of communication as the healthiest response to emotional pain. We hear advice like, "talk it out," or "tell people how you feel." While that's often helpful, real human behavior is rarely that simple. For many people, emotional pain doesn't activate the urge to speak, it activates the urge to retreat. Instead of moving toward others, they instinctively move away. This reaction isn't necessarily planned. In many cases, it's the brain's automatic attempt to reduce emotional danger. Imagine a conversation between close friends. One makes a sarcastic comment that unexpectedly hits a sensitive nerve. The other smiles politely, changes the subject, and becomes noticeably quieter for the rest of the evening. Later, they stop replying to messages as quickly as they used to. The silence isn't punishment. It's distance. Their mind is trying to answer an important question before opening up again. Is this relationship still emotionally safe? Psychologists often describe emotional safety as the feeling that you can express yourself without expecting ridicule, rejection, or dismissal. When that sense of safety is shaken, the brain begins scanning for potential threats. Deep inside the brain, structures involved in detecting danger become more active, preparing the body to protect itself. While we usually associate these systems with physical threats, research suggests that social rejection and emotional pain activate many of the same neural networks involved in physical pain. In other words, the brain often treats a painful conversation as something far more serious than just words. This helps explain a paradox. The people who care the most about a relationship are sometimes the ones who become the quietest after being hurt. If they didn't care, they might simply walk away without thinking twice. Silence often appears precisely because the relationship matters. Every sentence suddenly feels risky. Every emotional confession feels like another opportunity to be misunderstood. Not everyone responds this way, of course. Personality, upbringing, culture, and past experiences all shape how people react to emotional wounds. But one common pattern appears again and again. People who have repeatedly experienced rejection, criticism, or emotional invalidation often learn that expressing hurt doesn't solve problems. It creates new ones. Over time, silence becomes a strategy rather than an accident. Think about a child who cries after being embarrassed at school. If a caring adult listens patiently, comforts them, and helps them make sense of their feelings, that child learns an important lesson. Emotions are safe to express. But imagine a different response. "Stop crying. You're too sensitive. You're making a big deal out of nothing." After hearing messages like these often enough, the child may gradually conclude that showing pain only makes things worse. Years later, that lesson can quietly follow them into adult friendships and relationships. This is one reason psychologists talk about emotional learning. Our brains constantly build expectations based on previous experiences. If vulnerability has repeatedly led to shame, the mind starts predicting that the same outcome will happen again. These predictions aren't always accurate, but the brain prefers caution over risk. From an evolutionary perspective, it's safer to avoid possible harm than to assume everything will be fine. Interestingly, silence doesn't always mean someone has stopped thinking about the situation. In fact, the opposite is often true. The quieter a person becomes on the outside, the louder their internal conversation may become. They replay the interaction repeatedly, wondering whether they misunderstood something, whether they overreacted, or whether speaking up would only make everything worse. Cognitive psychologists call this rumination. the tendency to mentally revisit distressing events over and over. While reflection can help us learn, rumination often traps people inside their own thoughts without bringing real resolution. Here's where another misunderstanding appears. Quiet people are sometimes described as emotionally distant or cold, yet emotional intensity and outward expression are not the same thing. Some individuals experience emotions very deeply while showing remarkably little on the surface. Their silence isn't evidence of weak feelings. It may actually reflect how overwhelming those feelings have become. You can sometimes see this during disagreements between couples. One partner wants immediate discussion. They ask questions, seek reassurance, and try to resolve the conflict right away. The other grows increasingly quiet, looking away or answering with only a few words. At first glance, it seems like they don't care, but relationship researchers have found that withdrawal during conflict can sometimes happen because a person's stress levels become so high that continuing the conversation feels emotionally impossible. Their nervous system shifts into protection instead of connection. This is important because many arguments become trapped in a painful cycle. One person sees silence as rejection and pushes harder for answers. The quieter person feels increasingly overwhelmed and withdraws even more. Each person's attempt to solve the problem accidentally intensifies it. Neither side necessarily has bad intentions. They're simply responding to emotional pain in different ways. Another surprising reason people become quiet is the fear of saying something they'll regret. Strong emotions narrow attention and reduce our ability to think clearly. Many people recognize this intuitively. Rather than speaking while angry or deeply hurt, they choose silence until their emotions settle. In these moments, quietness isn't avoidance, it's self-control. But there is another layer that often goes unnoticed. Silence can also protect identity. When someone important hurts us, the pain isn't always about the event itself. Sometimes it challenges the way we see ourselves. A dismissive comment from a trusted friend can suddenly trigger questions like, "Am I not good enough?" Or, "Did I misunderstand this relationship completely?" Before responding outwardly, the mind first tries to rebuild its own sense of stability. Social psychology offers another clue. Human beings have a deep need to belong. Throughout evolution, being accepted by a group increased the chances of survival. Although modern life is very different, our brains still react strongly to signs of exclusion. Being ignored, mocked, or emotionally dismissed can activate alarm systems that evolved long before smartphones, offices, or social media existed. What looks like a small disagreement today can unconsciously resemble social rejection at a much deeper level. Ironically, modern technology sometimes amplifies this process. A message remains unread for hours. A thoughtful text receives only a one-word reply. Someone who usually shares everything suddenly disappears from the conversation. Digital communication leaves countless gaps for the brain to fill, and our minds are surprisingly creative when information is missing. Psychologists call this negative interpretation bias, the tendency to assume the worst when situations are ambiguous, especially when we're already emotionally vulnerable. Of course, not every period of silence has a healthy explanation. Sometimes people withdraw to avoid accountability, manipulate others, or escape difficult conversations indefinitely. Healthy psychology means recognizing patterns without assuming every quiet person shares the same motives. Context always matters. Silence can represent healing, fear, reflection, exhaustion, or avoidance. Understanding the difference requires patience rather than quick judgment. Perhaps the most important insight is that emotional silence often isn't about the words being left unsaid. It's about trust. Speaking honestly requires believing that another person will listen with curiosity instead of criticism. When trust weakens, language often weakens with it. The voice becomes quieter because the emotional bridge between two people feels less certain. The encouraging part is that these patterns are not permanent. Human brains remain capable of learning throughout life. Psychologists call this neuroplasticity. the brain's ability to reorganize itself through new experiences. A person who once learned that vulnerability leads to rejection can gradually discover something different through relationships built on consistency, empathy, and genuine listening. One conversation rarely changes years of emotional learning, but many safe conversations often do. This also reminds us to be careful with the assumptions we make. When someone becomes quiet, it's tempting to fill the silence with our own interpretation. We might assume they're angry, uninterested, or simply difficult. But human behavior is rarely explained by a single moment. Every reaction carries invisible experiences, memories, expectations, and fears that we cannot immediately see. So the next time someone grows unusually quiet after being hurt, consider the possibility that their silence isn't empty. It may be carrying disappointment, caution, reflection, or the hope that someone will notice what words can no longer express. Sometimes the loudest emotional message is delivered without a single sentence. Understanding this doesn't mean accepting unhealthy communication or ignoring problems. It means recognizing that silence, like every human behavior, has a psychology behind it. The more we understand those hidden patterns, the less likely we are to judge people only by what they say or don't say. If you enjoy exploring the hidden psychology behind everyday human behavior, consider subscribing to Psyche Lens. Every conversation, every habit, and every reaction has a story beneath the surface. And perhaps the most important question to leave with is this: the next time someone says nothing at all, will you hear only the silence, or will you wonder what their mind is trying to protect?